Charlie Kirk's funeral wasn't just another farewell, it was a spectacle that gripped the entire nation. Nobody could have predicted what unfolded inside that hall. As the cameras zoomed in and the crowd hushed, it wasn't politics, it wasn't a staged tribute. It was raw, personal, and shocking. A moment so intense it left even his critics speechless, an act of grief and devotion that seemed bigger than the man himself. The weight of that day hit like thunder. Arizona became the epicenter of mourning when Charlie's body was flown in on Air Force Two, a move that screamed power and influence no matter what people thought of him. From the instant his flag-draped coffin entered the room, the atmosphere changed. Silence spread like smoke, broken only by the sound of footsteps echoing against the floor. White flower baskets lined the space, soft light flickered over tear-streaked faces, and whispered prayers cut through the heavy air. And yet, it wasn't just family in the room. Vice President J.D. Vance and his wife were seated among the mourners. Proof that this wasn't just a funeral, it was a national statement. Flags outside were lowered to half-mast as if the grief pouring out of Arizona had spilled over state lines, wrapping the entire country in a cloud of sorrow and controversy. But nothing struck harder than the sight of his wife Erica and their children sitting inches from the coffin.
And we realized everything that the people in the crowd witnessed, that law enforcement dealt with, but I do want to make sure that your viewers understand the trauma and the emotions that are filled with Charlie's protection detail that's been with him for many years.
They weren't just grieving, they were a haunting reminder that Charlie wasn't just a firebrand or a media personality. He was a father, a husband, a man whose story ended too abruptly. Every movement carried meaning. The slow march of the procession, the folding of the flag, the suffocating silence. It wasn't simply a goodbye. It was a performance of eternity, one that left the world shaken. The service balanced national symbolism with the intimacy of a family farewell, but then came a moment that shattered expectations. People had prepared for routine eulogies, rehearsed speeches, and careful tributes. Instead, what they got was Erica Kirk's raw, unfiltered grief, a personal act that instantly became the unforgettable centerpiece of the day. The shift was electric. What had been a heavy ritual suddenly cracked open into something painfully genuine. For the first time, the widow's sorrow overshadowed the politics, the power, and even the presence of dignitaries. All eyes turned as Erica stepped out of the shadows of silence and walked down the main aisle toward her husband's coffin. Dressed in a simple black dress, she was the very picture of heartbreak. The crowd froze. You could feel the air being sucked out of the room. Until that day, Erica had been nearly invisible, keeping herself away from cameras, sharing only short, cryptic posts online. But now, standing under the gaze of the nation, she made her move. Each step toward the coffin carried a weight that words couldn't describe. When she finally reached the flag-draped casket, she stopped, trembling. Her hand rose slowly, before pressing gently against the polished wood. The gesture was so small, but it hit harder than any speech, any tribute, any staged moment could have. Witnesses swore the silence in that hall was suffocating. Her shoulders shook as she leaned in, grief crashing over her like a storm. This wasn't about cameras or the vice president in the front row. This was a wife stripped bare in front of the world, breaking under the reality of loss. No script, no preparation, just truth. The photos released later only amplified the power of that instant. Erica's body pressed against the coffin, hands gripping the wood as though she needed it to keep herself upright. For the first time, America didn't just see the activist, the commentator, or the polarizing figure. They saw the man and the family left behind. The tragedy wasn't abstract anymore. It was human, raw, and gut-wrenching. This wasn't political theater, it was the human cost of an assassination. Erica's gesture, unplanned and unfiltered, became the defining image of the funeral. A widow, clinging to her husband's coffin, left a scar on the hearts of everyone watching, and no one in that room, or the millions who later saw the images, would ever forget it. From that single trembling gesture, Erica's tribute transformed into something no one was ready for. The air grew heavier, the silence sharper, and then came the most devastating moment of the entire funeral. Erica leaned over the open coffin, and in front of family, politicians, and cameras, she reached out and took her husband's cold hand. That image, the living holding the dead, snatched the breath out of the room and burned itself into memory forever. The cameras didn't miss it. Within hours, the photo was everywhere, splashed across phones and headlines. But for those who sat in that hall, it was no simple image. It was a raw, unfiltered act of love and despair. At first, Erica's grip was light, almost hesitant. Then it tightened, clinging as though she could anchor him back to the living. Her tears poured freely, running down her cheeks as she pressed her forehead against his still body. Witnesses later admitted they could barely stand to watch. The sight of a wife clinging to her husband's lifeless hand was too much. It was tragedy in its purest form. The video only deepened the pain. Clips showed Erica kissing his hand, burying her face against it, refusing to let go. The formality of the ceremony collapsed in that instant. This wasn't about tradition or politics anymore. It was about a woman drowning in loss, holding on to the last thread tying her to the man she loved. No polished eulogy, no grand gestures, just a hand bridging the gap between life and death. That simplicity is what made it so devastating. It was grief stripped to its bones. It was love refusing to die, even when the body had. Millions who later saw the photos felt it deep in their chest. People who despised Charlie Kirk's politics admitted they couldn't escape the weight of that moment. For once, the debate paused. What people remembered wasn't the speeches, wasn't the flags or the dignitaries. It was Erica's hand wrapped around Charlie's. It became the defining image of the funeral, a symbol of devotion so desperate that even death couldn't break it. A moment of human truth that the world could not look away from. And then, boom! The public reaction erupted like wildfire. Within hours, the photos and clips of Erica Kirk clutching her husband's cold hand were everywhere. Front pages, breaking news alerts, endless timelines. There was no escape. What gripped the world wasn't the line of dignitaries or the stiff rituals. It was the raw, unbearable image of a woman holding her husband for the last time. For Charlie Kirk's loyal supporters, that moment instantly became sacred. They flooded social media, calling it the most powerful tribute of the entire service. Stronger than any speech, stronger than any flag, one post read. They called it proof of love, loyalty, and resilience. A final vow made in front of the nation. Prayers poured in. Promises were made to carry on his mission. For them, Erica's actions weren't just grief, they were a battle cry. But the impact went way beyond his political base. Even some of his fiercest critics, the ones who clashed with his every word, admitted they felt the gut punch of that gesture. Commentators who normally shredded Kirk on air stopped mid-broadcast to acknowledge the humanity of it. For a fleeting moment, those endless red versus blue walls cracked. Across newsrooms, Twitter threads, even kitchen tables, people agreed. That pain was bigger than politics. Churches across the country seized on it too, weaving the photos into sermons, preaching that Erica's grief was living proof that love can outlast death. Pastors called it a testimony in action. Vows were renewed at weddings, couples cited her as inspiration, and faith communities declared it a message sent straight from heaven. The national media jumped on the wave. Instead of policy talk, newscasts filled airtime with family stories and photo montages. Opinion pieces gushed over the human cost of violence. The image had swallowed the headlines whole. Erica's hand became the face of the tragedy. A tragedy no speech, no press release could ever truly capture. But the fire didn't stop there. When Erica finally stood to speak, the world went still. Her voice cracked with sorrow, yet carried a steel edge of conviction. She didn't speak like a politician's wife, carefully curated for the cameras. She spoke like a woman who had just buried the love of her life, and like a mother trying to shield her children from heartbreak too heavy for them to carry. She painted Charlie as more than the polarizing figure the media portrayed. To her, he was a man of purpose, driven by faith, a protective father, a husband who lived for his family even when the cameras were off. Her words stripped away the headlines and left behind the man. Then came the moment that gutted the entire room. Erica shared what she whispered to their daughter to soften the blow of losing her father. "Daddy's on a mission with Jesus," she said softly. That single line silenced the crowd. People wept openly. It wasn't politics, it wasn't legacy. It was a desperate mother clutching at the only comfort she could give her little girl. And with her last words, Erica promised the one thing the nation didn't expect to hear. Charlie's voice would not die with him. She vowed his mission would live on, through her, through their children, through every soul who believed his fight was not finished. She didn't just speak her grief, she turned it into a vow. Erica promised she would raise their children with the very same values Charlie lived and fought for. And then, with her voice trembling but fierce, she urged the audience to find their strength not in rage, but in faith. In that moment, her tears hardened into determination. Her message was undeniable. Her husband's death would not kill his mission, it would ignite it. Her tribute was both tender and commanding, pulling every heart in the room into her orbit. What started as a farewell turned into a declaration that Charlie's influence would live on, through his family, through his faith, and through the movement he had left behind. It was the emotional core of the service, a moment that fused loss with defiance and faith. It was everywhere. From the very first prayer whispered at the pulpit to the final hymn that shook the walls, Christianity framed the entire event. Scripture wasn't read like tradition. It was read like a shield, a lifeline. Every verse landed heavy. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Psalm 46 verse 1 thundered across the room, and jaws clenched as many realized. Erica had posted that exact verse on social media just hours before the assassination. Now, hearing it again in that hall felt chilling, as though prophecy had closed its circle. It was faith warning of the storm before it struck. The music deepened the spell. Choirs rose, voices breaking with tears yet soaring with devotion. For some, it was pure worship. For others, it was their only release from suffocating grief. The sound created a strange tension where sorrow and hope lived side by side. People swayed, some raised their hands to the ceiling, others simply wept. But all of it built an atmosphere that was less like a funeral and more like a spiritual battlefield. And at the center of it all stood Erica, pointing everyone back to faith. She reminded mourners that Charlie's mission was never about headlines or politics. It was about something eternal. She admitted the only reason she could stand at his coffin and speak without collapsing was because she trusted God's plan. Even in her tragedy, she anchored the room to her belief that this loss wasn't the end, but part of a story written long before. This wasn't staged as a rally, nor was it just a public memorial. It was something else entirely, a blending of faith, grief, and power that left the nation asking, was this a goodbye? Or the beginning of something far bigger? The faith-soaked ceremony didn't just stay in that Arizona hall, it burst out into the world, and the reactions hit like a storm. Within hours, clips of Erica quoting scripture, holding Charlie's hand, and vowing to raise their children in faith were everywhere. Mainstream networks looped the footage on repeat, while social media fractured into two camps: those who saw her as a pillar of strength and those who accused her of turning her husband's funeral into a stage for politics and religion. Supporters framed the moment as divine. Posts praised Erica as a modern Ruth, a woman standing in the ashes yet refusing to bow. Conservative commentators called it proof that Charlie's mission wasn't ending, it was only beginning. Hashtags like #MissionWithJesus and #KirkLegacy flooded feeds with thousands promising donations to organizations tied to his name. To his base, Erica wasn't just grieving, she was stepping into his shoes, taking up his fight in front of the nation. But critics weren't silent. Progressive voices fired back, accusing the service of being less about mourning and more about branding. This isn't a funeral, it's a rally in disguise, one journalist tweeted, sparking debates that raged across timelines. Others accused Erica of exploiting her husband's death to solidify influence, arguing that her words about raising their kids in Charlie's values sounded less like a mother's vow and more like a political agenda wrapped in scripture. Even religious leaders clashed over the symbolism. Some pastors declared it the most moving public witness of faith they'd ever seen. Others blasted it as weaponized grief, warning that faith was being used as a shield to deflect from Kirk's controversial legacy. Suddenly, Erica wasn't just a widow, she was a lightning rod standing at the intersection of love, loss, and ideology. News panels leaned in hard. One segment cut between Erica's trembling voice and past clips of Charlie sparking outrage on college campuses. Commentators asked if the funeral was rewriting his legacy before the public's eyes. Was this ceremony about who Charlie was, or about how his supporters wanted him remembered? And the bigger question loomed, was Erica now becoming the movement's new face? Meanwhile, the images of her holding his hand and whispering to her daughter kept circulating, stripped from politics and shared by everyday people. On Instagram, strangers wrote that even if they disagreed with Charlie's every word, they couldn't scroll past without crying. TikTok edits paired the footage with gospel tracks, racking up millions of views. The internet was split, but united in obsession. By the end of the week, Erica's private act of mourning had transformed into a national flashpoint. To some, she was the embodiment of faith under fire. To others, she was a symbol of manipulation. Grief turned into propaganda. But no one could deny this. Her presence, her words, and her faith had stretched the funeral far beyond Arizona. The moment had become bigger than loss. It was now a cultural war over memory, meaning, and legacy. It was intimate, it was raw, and it hit the world like a dagger. To those inside the hall, it was a family crushed by grief. To the millions watching from afar, it was a message broadcast loud and clear. The pain would never leave, but faith would be the anchor pulling the Kirk family forward. Charlie Kirk's funeral carried the heaviness of a sudden personal tragedy, but also the weight of a national reckoning. His life, his controversies, and his death had become impossible to separate. The room was packed with familiar faces. Political leaders stood shoulder to shoulder with family, friends, and loyal supporters. Vice President J.D. Vance and his wife Usha were front and center, their presence impossible to ignore. They had personally joined the solemn flight back to Arizona as Charlie's casket arrived draped in the American flag aboard Air Force Two. That single gesture made one thing clear: Charlie Kirk, polarizing or not, had reached the top tiers of political power. Soldiers in uniform carried the coffin with precision, elevating the farewell from a family's loss to a national moment. Even Donald Trump, though absent, marked his presence by ordering flags to half-mast nationwide. The symbolism was staggering. This wasn't just a funeral. It was a staged declaration of how far Kirk's voice had reached. Condolences poured in by the hour. Governors, senators, international allies, they all weighed in, sketching Charlie as not just a firebrand, but as someone who shaped the tone of a generation's political conversation. His critics may have painted him as toxic, but in death, the flood of tributes recast him as something bigger, an undeniable force. Still, inside that hall, the politics couldn't erase the grief. The air remained heavy, intimate, with every focus locked on Erica and her children. Dignitaries bowed their heads, but not to overshadow, only to acknowledge the staggering loss in front of them. The mix of private mourning and public recognition gave the event an unsettling duality. Was it a family's farewell or the canonization of a movement? The most haunting sight wasn't the speeches or the salutes, it was the children. Their small silhouettes sat in the front row, sometimes cradled in Erica's arms, sometimes perched beside family members, staring out with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Their innocence collided with the cruelty of the moment, making the tragedy almost unbearable. For many in attendance, seeing those children drove home what words never could. The human cost of an assassination is always bloodier, always crueler than any headline admits. Erica addressed it head on. She shared how she'd tried to soften the blow for her daughter, whispering, "Daddy's on a mission with Jesus." A simple phrase, but one that ricocheted across the room, across television broadcasts, across the internet. The line became a ghost of the funeral, replayed and quoted everywhere, haunting anyone who heard it. The symbolism of the children was undeniable. When Erica vowed that Charlie's mission would never be silenced, the cameras captured her turning toward them. It was clear she saw her children as living links to the future of his legacy, too young to grasp the reality, but destined to grow up carrying the values he preached, guided by their mother's unshakable resolve. The images sealed the tragedy: a father gone, a family broken, a nation watching. Erica collapsed against the coffin, clutching Charlie's hand as her tears spilled onto his still fingers. Photographers captured every frame, her face pressed against his chest, her body refusing to let go. It was agony frozen in time. And yet, other images told their own stories. The coffin being carried by soldiers, the flight on Air Force Two, Erica walking alongside the vice president and his wife, all of it underscored that this wasn't just mourning, it was history being written in real time. But above all else, it was the children, sitting silent, fragile, and forever changed, that delivered the gut punch. Their presence didn't just magnify the loss, it stripped away the politics and left behind the unvarnished truth. 2 young lives had been shattered, and nothing could ever restore what was taken from them. Each photo from that funeral wasn't just an image, it was history burning itself into the nation's memory. Together, those shots told a story words could never capture. Grief so raw, it shattered politics, and love so fierce, it refused to let go. Erica herself pushed the images out to the world, posting 12 haunting photos, clinging, praying, breaking down against the casket. Her chilling caption read, "They had no idea what they had awakened." In that instant, she transformed from widow into warrior, grief into challenge. Supporters called the images both devastating and inspiring. Even critics admitted the photos cut deeper than speeches, exposing the brutal cost of tragedy in a way no headline ever could. It wasn't policy, it wasn't power, it was the humanity of a woman holding on to her husband for the very last time, and that is why the nation couldn't look away. The funeral was filled with symbols, rituals, and dignitaries, but when the noise faded, one truth towered above the rest. Charlie Kirk's legacy was cemented by his wife's tribute. Her clasped hands, Her words of faith, her promise to raise their children in his values, that became the emotional heart of the ceremony, the moment that history will remember. Those images won't fade. They'll outlive debates, investigations, and headlines. They'll stand as eternal reminders of the grief of a widow, the strength of a mother, and the pain of a family forever altered. They transformed Charlie Kirk from a political firebrand into something far more haunting, a man remembered through the raw devotion of the family he left behind. In the end, his story now has two halves: the public mission he fought while alive, and the eternal farewell sealed by his wife's tears at his coffin. Together, they form a legacy America will not soon forget. And that's where we close this chapter. If you were gripped by this story, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, because this is one legacy, one tragedy, and one funeral the nation will be talking about for years to come.